أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا Muhammad وآله الطاهرين. Assalamu alaikum, dear viewers, and welcome to another episode of the Dictations. Inshallah, in today's session, we'll be speaking about, I guess, a sort of an extension of our previous talk on ujub. But we're going to look at it from a slightly different perspective, or not even from a different perspective. We're going to probably look into one of the consequences of what happens when you are so obsessed with yourself, essentially. And inshallah, we're going to, try and unpack some of the things that we do as, fallible human beings in order to justify our blunders, our mistakes, simply because we are so, we have ujub, we have conceit, and we have this obsession with sort of, being right all the time. And before we do that, I want to just quote a proverb in the Arabic language. There's a proverb that I'm going to pull out over here. Anza walau tarat. Okay? Or anz walau tarat. There's both ways you can say it. Anza walau tarat. It's a goat even if it flies. Now, what's the sort of backstory to this? Essentially, this is a proverb. It's a very popular proverb in the Arab world. There's these two men who are, I guess, in a jungle or in some forest. They're somewhere in a place where there's no one else is there, and you have a bunch of trees. And they're looking at the tree, and they're looking at the tree branch from a distance, and they see something black and sitting on the branch, on a tree branch, and they're unable to figure out what it actually is. But they can tell that it's black. Okay, so they're looking at it, and one of the guys says that, I think it's a crow. Okay, I think it's a crow. And the other guy says, no, it's a goat. So they kind of keep, they go closer to that thing. They're getting closer to that tree. And as they get closer and closer and closer, one of the guys sort of claps, and lo and behold, this animal that was, sort of all covered up, it starts to fly, and it flies away. And the man says, well, you see, I told you it was a crow. And then the other guy responds back saying, it's a goat, even if it flies. Okay, meaning it's a goat, meaning, whatever happens, my opinion is correct. And essentially, this became into a proverb in the Arabic language. It's a goat even if it flies, and it's a reference to people who, even after their, mistakes are shown and they become clear, the mistakes become obviously known, like in this story, where, once that bird flies, well, obviously it's going to be a crow. It's going to be a bird. So it can't be a goat. Goats don't fly. But yet the person is going to try and justify their mistakes or their error at any cost, because they just can't see themselves as wrong. They can't afford to be, they think that they can never be wrong. So in this case, the man says, well, it's a goat. Even if it ends up flying, well, it's a goat, maybe it's a flying goat. So, and they start giving these, absurd possibilities. Right, and they might even start arguing, well, it's not inherently impossible for a goat to fly. Allah can make a goat that can fly. Well, yeah, Allah can make a goat that flies, but Allah hasn't made a goat that flies. That's what we've observed in this world so far. And essentially that becomes a sort of proverb in the Arabic language. Anza walau tarat. Okay, it's a goat even if it, even if it happens to fly. The underlying message behind this proverb is, oftentimes we have, mistakes, and we make blunders, and we have errors in our, errors that we commit in our lives, in our life, but yet we put on this cloak of goodness. Okay, this cloak of pure, goodness, or infallibility. Even if you can call it an infallibility cloak rather than an invisibility cloak. You can call it an infallibility cloak, and you sort of put it on yourself, and you begin to interpret everything that you say and do from that lens. And essentially, you begin to justify, the mistakes and the errors that you commit, and any mistake that you commit, you will find some sort of an explanation or some sort of a justification to defend it. Okay, and insan is always wants to do that. Every human wants to see themselves as sinless and someone who cannot make mistakes, but yet they will look at everybody else with a cloak of evil, as if even when somebody else does something good, they're gonna, especially if they don't like the other person, they're gonna look at them from a negative lens and try to interpret their behavior from a negative perspective. So you put on a garb of goodness on your own self, and very easily you put on a garb of, or a cloak of, errors and blemishes and shortcomings on other people. And this is something that I even quoted in the ayah that I in the session on ujub, in the dictation on ujub, which this ayah from Surah 35 verse number 8, where it says, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about what shaitan does for insan, and it says, أَفَمَنْ زُيِّنَ لَهُ سُوءُ عَمَلِهِ فَرَآهُ حَسَنًا. Okay, is the one whose evil deed is made to look beautiful to him. Okay, zuyina is from zina, meaning is somebody, there is someone. The ayah obviously continues. This is not the full ayah, but essentially what it's saying is that shaitan comes and it makes, shaitan makes your evil deeds appear beautiful to you. So much so that you actually start considering it and start seeing it as good. Fara'ahu hasana. You start seeing your evil deeds as good deeds. Okay, and this is something that is mentioned in the Quran, that shaitan comes and it almost gives you this cloak, this infallibility cloak that you can put on yourself, and now you can sort of find an explanation and a justification for all of your evil deeds, because all you're seeing is goodness everywhere. From all of your evil deeds and all of your shortcomings are now seen as good. And insan, we do this a lot. We are very good at finding explanations and justifications for our blunders. And this is obviously because, we are struck with the problem of ujub. We are, this moral vice of conceit is, unfortunately within us. And we haven't actively tried to fight it. Because if you try to fight ujub and you remain in a state of constant reflection and thinking about, the decisions that you are making, the actions that you are, doing, and, what you're doing essentially in life, you will be less prone to seeing your evil deeds as good, because you're going to be constantly God conscious at that point. You're going to be aware that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching every action of mine. But yet, unfortunately, insan, is not able to maintain that level of God consciousness for most of their, most of the times. Now, and the thing is, there are justifications that people give which are very, very interesting, right? Because when you do something immoral, especially when you do something wrong, one of the things that we say is that the insan's fitra, the insan's sort of, your moral intuition will actually always tell you when you do something wrong. But yet we see that somehow, insan, you're going to be able to justify it, because you're seeing it as good, even though your moral intuition is telling you that what you're doing is wrong. But yet you're going to start seeing it as something good. And that's where the problem, is. That your lens is being ruined. And in order for your, once your lens and the way you're looking at things is beautiful, you still have to find a way to content your heart. Because your heart is telling you that it's something is not right. Okay, you're not doing something wrong. So what you end up doing, in your mind, is that you start to find justifications for your evil deeds, right? Because on the one hand, you're seeing yourself, you're committing an action, you're committing some sort of a mistake, let's say, or a blunder, or even a sin, and you are seeing it now as beautiful, but your moral intuitions are telling you that this is wrong. In order to make those moral intuitions calm and sort of ignore them, well, you have to tell your heart something. Otherwise, your innate sort of intuition is not going to let you go, and you won't be able to sleep at night, especially if you commit some sort of a heinous crime or something. Now, what are the type of justifications that we give? Okay, once you put this infallibility cloak on you, well, the cloak is just on top of you, which is just making you see things as good. But what justifications do you give for yourself on the inside? Okay, how does insan justify, moral vices for him or herself? And there are a couple of ways that we do that. There's a couple of ways that we do that, right? Because you are forced to do it. You're forced to do it in order for your heart to reconcile with what you are observing. Okay, otherwise there's going to be a contradiction, and insan doesn't want to live in contradictions. They want to live with some level of consistency, even if that consistency is, flawed, there's a fallacy in it, or it's made up. One of the very simple ways that we try to justify our immoral behavior and our bad deeds is simply by, reconstructing the moral value of that action. Okay, so for example, let's say, an insan or someone does, someone backbites. Now, backbiting is considered immoral. Not only immoral, it is also shar'an, legally it is also haram, it's prohibited. But, we backbite. Okay, insan backbites. But if you notice, many times we try to justify our backbiting by, reconstructing the moral perception around it, and by saying that no, what we're doing is actually pretty good. We are, backbiting, or we won't even use the term backbiting, but we're going to say that we are saying these things because we love and we care for this person, right? We're letting other people know about the issues that this such and such person has, to raise awareness about the difficulties and the challenges that this individual is going through, so perhaps the community can come out and help them. Okay, so what you're really doing is that you are, convincing yourself and convincing other people that you are doing this because you care for the person. So this is not an immoral thing, this is actually a moral thing. I'm saying these things, or I'm exposing certain shortcomings about a certain person out of the care that I have for them. Okay, so what you're going to see is that oftentimes when people backbite about a certain individual, they may even start using terms like miskeen, or somebody is, that poor guy, or that poor person, he or she has certain blemishes. May Allah help them get rid of these deficiencies. Okay, so you're gonna, even start changing the way you're gonna address the issue of backbiting. You're gonna start using these terms to make people feel like, you're not really backbiting, or the things that you're saying is actually pretty good. And this is what we do. There's a interesting documentary by Joshua Oppenheimer. It was called The Art of Killing. Okay, and it's a very interesting, if you're into these type of documentaries, it's a very interesting documentary called The Act of Killing. And this documentary essentially covers exposes how there was basically a mass, genocide in 1965, 1966 in Indonesia, where essentially, many of the communists were killed. People who ascribed to communism or had some sort of political relationship with, communist individuals even, or in the government, they were killed. Women, children, everyone was killed. Many people were killed. Okay, and this documentary tries to, document that entire story. So what ends up happening is that this producer, this filmmaker, Joshua, his name is Oppenheimer, I believe is how you pronounce his last name. He goes and he finds the mastermind behind the killing. And he tries to get him to explain, what did you do? Tell us about the murders that you committed. And what this film producer ends up noticing is that these individuals who were behind the killing, they are so content, and they have justified the evil that they committed by making it appear that no, what we were doing was something that was just, something that was moral, something that was required for us to do, and that what we were doing was not immoral. And they came up with many justifications, to the extent that these people start to reenact the murders that they were committing. Anyways, it's an interesting documentary, and the film producer also there's a clip of him, explaining how he saw that, he thought he would have a very hard time getting information out of these individuals, but no, they were just openly speaking about it, and they were very happy about it and very proud of it, and speaking about the gory details, how they came into villages and lit them on fire, and how they killed people and so on, all because in their minds what they have done is that they have justified the evil and turned it into something which is, in their minds they're like, no, we're not doing anything evil. Okay, this is something that is very, very important. So in order to justify the evil, you're going to have to reconstruct the moral perceptions of that act. Okay, so if backbiting is seen as immoral, what you're going to do is you're going to try and reconstruct the moral perceptions people have around it, about it, around you. People around you, the moral perception people around you have about backbiting, you're going to try and change their perceptions about it. So backbiting is immoral. So what you're going to do is you're going to start saying, well, this person is miskeen. I'm only doing this because I care about him. So now the moral perception of people is like, okay, he's doing it out of care. So this is now a moral thing. Very interestingly, governments change moral perceptions all the time, right? They want to make something look normal in society. So they will come and they will, use their media, use propaganda, use TV advertising, and just the media in general, and they will try and change your moral perceptions about different things, right? So, and that's obviously a very, very powerful way to get people to commit, vices. And people now, as I said, internally people may always realize and recognize that this is, intuitively they might realize that this is wrong. But yet, because the moral perception has changed outside, because the lens has been changed, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that they have made evil look like good, people are gonna end up committing those vices. I was in that, I think I mentioned one of the classes that I attended was of Rijalul Kashi with Sheikh Yusufi Gharabi. Sheikh Yusufi Gharabi is a very well-known historian in Iran. He's in Qom. He studied in Najaf as well. He's a very well-known, historian. And he was giving these Rijalul Kashi classes. Rijalul Kashi, for those who don't know, is one of the main Rijal books that we have. Books of Rijal, books of Ilm al-Rijal. Maybe someday we will discuss, those topics as well. Anyways, he was giving these classes in basically Fayziyah. Fayziyah is a hawza, it's a seminary. And, on the backside of the Fayziyah, he was giving these classes for about a year and a half. And then I think he stopped for a bit. And now, from what I've heard, he's continuing them again. Or he has continued them. Anyways, in the middle of that class, I think one time the topic of Abu Lulu came up. Abu Lulu was most likely a Zoroastrian man who lived in Medina. And he's more famously acknowledged to be the one who killed the second caliph, Umar. Anyways, there's a whole story behind Abu Lulu and why did he kill the second khalifa, second caliph, he was angry with the second khalifa, and so on. Anyways, he kills the second khalifa. And then there's this entire, story that is made up about him by later, in later Shia communities, a story was made up about him. And I've written about this as well, where to the extent they made up an entire story that, somehow he hid in the house of Imam Ali, and then Imam Ali teleported him to Iran, and he was in Kashan, and he lived in Kashan, and eventually he died in Kashan. Kashan is a city in Iran, and then he has a shrine in Kashan, and so on. This is a story that they made up. It's not real. Abu Lulu, based on most historical accounts, he killed himself. He did suicide by stabbing himself because the companions or the people in Medina were chasing him after he had killed the second Khalifa. So they were chasing him, and then he basically managed to kill himself. That's that's the historical account. Anyways, if that's the case, the question was, then what is this shrine doing in Kashan, right? Because people, at least from the right before the Safavid era, because Sayyid Ibn Tawus also makes a reference to this sort of shrine in Kashan. So they're saying this shrine is the shrine of Abu Lulu. And, so if Abu Lulu killed himself in Medina, then whose shrine is this, right? And there's a book called Kashan Dar Masire Tashayyo by Mustafa Sadiqi. He's a researcher in Iran. So Sheikh Gharawi mentioned this book. And in this book, anyways, he researches the presence of Tashayyo in the city of Kashan. It's available online as well in the PDF in Farsi, it's in Persian. And he says that, this shrine of Abu Lulu is not Abu Lulu's shrine. It probably belonged to some Sufi saint or someone. And essentially, the reason why they turned it into Abu Lulu's shrine is because the Safavids, obviously they were in war with the Ottomans. They were in conflict with the Ottomans. And the Ottomans are Sunnis. And the thing is, Safavid Iran was also Sunni at one point. And in order to get people to be able to fight the Ottomans and not make them feel confused, almost like how the Muslims felt confused in the Battle of Jamal, right? Or in the Battle of Siffin, where, in the Battle of Jamal, people are confused. Well, there's a wife of the Prophet on one side, there's companions on her side, well, there's Amir al-Mu'minin on one side. How am I going to go and kill another believer? There was confusion. Or in the Battle of Siffin, people are like, well, they raised the Quran on the spears. Why would we go and fight, a group of people who are raising the Quran and so on? In order to avoid that confusion, what they did is that they started to attribute certain shrines in Iran. So it's not even just in Kashan. Okay, that's the funny thing. There's a reference to another shrine of Abu Lulu in a place in Khurasan, in about 150 kilometers away from Mashhad, called Turbat-e Haydariye. It's a town, small village called, well, now it's a small town. It used to be a pretty well-known city in the past. It's called Turbat-e Haydariye. There's a shrine there as well attributed to Abu Lulu. So what the Safavids would do is that they would create these fake shrines and attribute them to Abu Lulu, and get the Shias to come out and use it as a place where they can, do curse the Sahaba, curse especially the second Khalifa. And what that allowed them to do, and, speak about the oppressions that the caliphs did and so on and so forth. What that allowed the Safavids to do is to change the perceptions of these people so that when they go fight the Ottomans, who are Sunnis, they can just see them as, not even Muslims. And it becomes easier to fight. So it was almost like a military strategy that they were doing, right? And this is basically well documented and researched. That's how these shrines became popular. And anyways, that Abu Lulu shrine is now shut down. It's been shut down for many years. It's not even actually funny thing, I actually went to see it anyways, because even though I know Abu Lulu is not buried there, but I was just interested to see these places. So I went there to check it out. It was closed. It didn't even let me in. But and they removed the name of Abu Lulu from the top, and they just said this is just like a historical site, and they don't allow anyone to go in. So the gates are closed. We tried to knock in, and there was some security guy sitting inside. We said, can we come in? He said, no, you couldn't come in. Anyway, I took some pictures and stuff, and that was it. So Kashan was not very far from Qom anyway. It was like an hour away from Qom. So my point here is that they reconstruct the perceptions, and when you commit a moral vice, or you make a mistake, you're able to justify it for yourself because you have reconstructed the moral perceptions of that thing. It's not even seen as evil, it's seen as good. So that's one of the first things, or one way people try to justify their behavior. Another way people justify their behavior is that they will use a very interesting language. They will change the language and the vocabulary that they're essentially what I'm trying to say is that, imagine let's say you're jealous of someone. Okay, you're jealous of a person and you don't like them. Okay, and you want to rip into them. You want to just destroy them and so on. This happens quite a lot in the world of scholarship and the world of academics. People get jealousy is very common. So what ends up happening is that you don't like this individual, you don't like their views, you don't like them as a person, and you're gonna try and attack them now because maybe you might not have any answers for it. And you're seeing them getting successful, you're seeing them getting very big and acknowledgement and so on. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna attack this individual, even though morally that's not right. You know that you're jealous. But what you're gonna do is that you're gonna justify your behavior by telling everyone and telling yourself and convincing yourself that, look, this is not an attack, this is an academic critique that I'm doing. Okay, this is a constructive criticism that I'm giving to this individual. This is, feedback that I'm giving to an individual. But in reality, it doesn't appear like constructive criticism, nor is it, a genuine academic discussion. It's probably just mudslinging. And many times that's what it is. Or, this is very common. What people end up doing is, when they really don't like someone, especially in academics, that happens a lot. When you have a problem with someone, someone may have written a 20-page research paper on some topic, and you don't have any arguments against them. So what you're going to do is you're going to try and find, the slightest mistake. Maybe they got the page number wrong in a reference, or they got the title of a book wrong, it made a spelling mistake. And you're going to just zone in on that and focus on that and say, look, this person, they can't even reference the book properly. They can't even, and you kind of miss the entire main argument that the scholar was making. These, things are very, very common, unfortunately. You see people, it's so common to even see this that it's shocking. Like, I don't even know why or how, people become so heedless of what they're doing. Right? But once again, it's the infallibility cloak that they've put on themselves, that they cannot see that they're doing something wrong. Okay? As I said, inside they may know, in their heart they may know what they're doing is wrong, but shaitan has changed their perspective. They've put a lens that is allowing them to see things differently in a good way. And one of the ways you justify that for yourself on the inside is that, okay, the language, I'm doing an academic critique here. I'm just engaging in a mubahatha or academic discussion. This happens, a lot. So you change the language and you make it seem not as bad as it is. As a matter of fact, an academic critique is a moral thing. It's a good thing. Engage in academic criticism. What's wrong with that? So people are going to say, yeah, he's doing a good thing at that point. Another way you justify your shortcomings and your deficiencies is by comparison. Okay, you compare. This is very common in politics, right? You have one political party that comes in, people start saying, well, you're making all of these blunders. And what they're going to say is, well, look at the previous political parties that came in power. Look at the previous presidents and prime ministers and kings or whoever. Look at them and then look at us. So we're better. And what they're end up doing is that the shortcomings that they have, or the moral issues that they have and they're committing, is that when they compare it with the past, and they may be slightly better from what was in the past, what they're doing is that they're completely negating the immorality of what they're committing or what they're doing. Because what they're essentially saying is that we're not as bad. We're bad, but we're not that bad. So that's another way you convince yourself that, what I'm doing is perfectly fine, right? And that's, a way that you are now convincing yourself that, or, convincing your heart that what I'm seeing is correct. What I'm seeing, seeing is believing. What you're seeing is now, you're making your heart believe in it as well, basically. That's what you're ending up. That's what you're basically doing. Another way we try to, justify our shortcomings, our evil deeds at times, is that you attribute the responsibility to someone else. Okay, you attribute the responsibility to someone else. For example, in a military, this happens quite a lot. For example, the military may say to their soldiers that, go and commit any crime you want to commit. We as generals and commanders, we will take responsibility for it. And what now, even in our own Islamic philosophy of ethics, we consider an act to be moral or immoral when an individual does it out of their own will. Okay, so no act of an insan, of a human, can be qualified or characterized as moral or immoral if it was not done out of free will. If you force someone to do something, you cannot call that act moral or immoral, or at least you cannot call that individual, or blame that individual for committing a moral or immoral act, because it was not something that they willed. So free will, an act that is done from the free will, is when you can consider something to be moral or immoral. But in these type of scenarios, what the person is convincing themselves essentially is that they are doing something which they are not, it is out of their will. They're going to convince themselves that they are technically being forced to do this, right? Meaning if the commanders tell them to go and, destroy a city, and that us as generals and commanders will take responsibility for it, well, now the foot soldier has convinced himself that, I don't have a choice. And the moment I don't have a choice, well, now whatever I do cannot be called moral or immoral. As a matter of fact, the responsibility also is not mine, because I don't have any choice anyways. I've been given commands to do this. I've been given orders to do this. And this happens, unfortunately, not, military was just an example. This happens everywhere. This happens, in businesses, in organizations, in the masajid, even in mosques, in their committees, people. So, one way is to attribute the responsibility to one individual. And sometimes it's also, you diffuse the responsibility where 5 people are involved in a process, and everyone is just sort of kind of, expecting that other person will take responsibility. And at the end, nobody holds responsibility. Nobody is. And these are just, multiple ways that we end up convincing ourselves that, what we're doing is perfectly fine, right? And obviously, one other way that you can convince yourself that, what I did was not wrong or what I did was not immoral is you blame other people. And blaming is one of the easiest ways to get, to feel content about yourself. Okay, if somebody starts, swearing at you, and you punch them and you fight back, you punch them in the face. People might come up to you and say, why did you punch them? That's not a very nice thing to do. You're gonna say, well, they started it. So you blame them. So they started it. I was just defending myself. But you don't realize, well, perhaps the more ethical thing to do at that point would have been to not, make it worse, to not make the situation worse than what it already is, right? You could have chosen to not punch the person and maybe just completely ignore them and walk away. That probably would have been a better thing to do. That would have been a more moral thing to do, perhaps. But the moment you got angry and you punched them, so now you have to justify your anger and your retaliation, which was not equal. You retaliated far worse than what they were doing to you. But in order to justify that, because as I said, you're seeing it as a good act. You're not seeing it as a bad act. But deep down, you may realize it was a wrong thing to do. But you will make yourself content by saying, well, I wasn't really the cause of it. They provoked me to do it. They should be blamed for it, and take the conversation off of me. And that's essentially what people do. These are, different ways that insan justifies his or her behavior, right? And so look, there's so many ways. We're so creative when it comes to freeing ourselves from any errors and blunders. There's so many ways. Maybe these are just some of them. Perhaps there's even more ways. And what happens, this is to do with yourself. Okay, you free yourself from blunders and errors because you start seeing yourself as pure good. Now, many times, what ends up happening also is that you can do the same thing to other people as well. You can put an infallibility cloak or a cloak of evil on other people as well. And you can begin to interpret their entire lives through that cloak. Okay? And what do I mean by that? So we're obviously not talking about the infallibles that actually are infallible. So let's say the prophets and the imams. We're talking about general humans. Okay? Where nobody is infallible. Everyone is fallible. And what you end up doing is that you start seeing certain individuals through a completely, through a pure black and white lens. For whatever reason. But this black and white lens is a sign of poor critical thinking. For example, you may love someone so much that you put on this infallibility cloak on them, this covering of goodness, this cover of goodness, and now even their mistakes, you're unable to see them. Even their mistakes that they commit and the whole world can see it and recognize it, you're unable to recognize it and you're unable to see it because you think, well, no, they cannot do anything wrong. So even their wrongs, you're going to start justifying them. right? So this is, or somebody may be evil, but you put on this this cover of evil on them. Now, an evil person can do some good things as well in their lives, right? Humans are like that. No one is just pure evil. That anything that comes out of their, any act that they commit is just always 100% going to be evil. That doesn't exist, right? Every insan will do some good. But because you have this cloak on them, even their good deeds, you're going to come up with some sort of a interpretation, which is you're going to make sure that it's not positive. You're going to somehow twist it, maybe come up with some conspiracy theory or something. And this is, in psychology, this is called the halo and the horn effect. Okay, you put a halo, on top of individuals who you look up to, you love, you admire, and you put these evil horns on those who are just bad people, right? And then you somehow think that their entire life would have been like that. Once again, I remember my first ever Muharram. Here it was somewhere, not in Toronto, but it was here in Canada. I think back in 2017, my first Muharram lectures that I did. I forgot what I was talking about right now, but in the middle of my talk, somehow, I think I brought up Khalid bin Walid for some reason. My topic had nothing to do with Khalid bin Walid, but somehow Khalid bin Walid came up. And I think I may have said that, Khalid bin Walid was a pretty strong war, strategist, basically. He was a very smart commander. And I think I just said that for a couple of seconds and then I moved on. That was it. I just basically complimented Khalid on the strategies that he would make in war. If you study the conquests, right, it's not possible to deny that Khalid bin Walid was a very smart commander. I mean, at the end of the day, the Battle of Uhud, the way the Muslims were defeated, it was because of Khalid bin Walid, right? When the archers came off the hill in the Battle of Uhud, it was Khalid bin Walid that looked back. Khalid bin Walid was not even a Muslim. He was on the side of the mushrikeen. He looked back and he noticed that the archers were gone. So he got the mushrikeen army to come back, the kuffar to come back, and essentially damage the Muslims. That was also Khalid bin Walid. So he's not he was not somebody who didn't know how to fight. He had the skill set to do that. Anyways, I mentioned it, and I remember after the majlis was ended, one of the seniors, uncles, they came running up to me, and I was like, "What's going on?" They're like, can you just clarify the point about Khalid bin Walid? And by that time, I didn't even remember what I said about Khalid bin Walid because it was not even the main point of the majlis. So I said, what did I say? They said, well, you said he was a good commander. And I'm just looking at the uncle. I was like, well, yeah, he was. He's like, yeah, but people might think he was a good guy, right? So he basically made me go on the mic again and clarified that, the Shi'i position on Khalid bin Walid is that he was not a good guy. He was, he was just a bad guy because of the, usurping of the Khilafah and all the things that he did and so on. So I clarified that, but that's kind of what it is. Like, somebody may be evil and you may disagree with them and they were wrong and they committed, crimes, let's say. But doesn't mean that they don't have any things that you could acknowledge as good, right? And that's where this halo and a horn effect comes. And if you want to be a proper historian, somebody who is, a fair and unbiased historian, somebody who knows research, you cannot be afflicted with the halo and horn effect, okay? And you have to be very, very careful with it. For example, when you are reading or studying the early caliphs, for example, the khulafa or the sahaba of the Prophet, as a Shia I'm saying, right? You have to be very careful how you interpret them, because if you're looking at them from the horn effect, if you're affected by the horn effect essentially, and you're looking at it from this, you've put this garb of evil on them, then you're gonna not be able to see them in a fair light. What you're gonna end up doing is that, besides the errors and crimes that they committed, you're gonna now interpret their entire life from birth as evil. And, funny thing is, there are a lot of fabrications that have happened in the Shi'i books against the caliphs, which are very funny sometimes. There was a funny one, I think, in Al-Hidayat al-Kubra, where, let's say the first two caliphs are blamed for every single crime that has existed, that has happened since the time, Qabil killed Habil, right? And then apparently they were there, the first two caliphs were there everywhere. Now, Al-Hidayat al-Kubra by Al-Khasibi, it's a Nusayri book. I mean, it's not really a trustworthy book, but I'm just saying, look, people can go wild with their imaginations, right? So you're unable to see that maybe these guys perhaps did do something that was good as well. Their crimes or their mistakes began at a certain point of their life, which was not the earlier time in Islam. Maybe it was later on, but you gotta be fair, basically. And likewise with the Sahaba, with the rest of the Sahaba, right? Not all the Sahaba that were evil and bad. You cannot say the prophetic community after the Holy Prophet spent 23 years that they all became some sort of an irreligious community, and evil was just being spread everywhere and indecencies were being committed. No, that's not what happened. The community is generally a religious community. Yes, the Khilafah, based on the Shia opinion, the Imam Shia told, it was usurped. And yes, we condemn that and we call it out. But doesn't mean the entire Muslim Ummah was now, engaging in indecencies and evil and so on. No, it was just like any other community and any other Islamic Muslim community that has ever existed. There was good, there was bad. But it's your lens that has to be think. Now, this is also true for the Sunnis, right? The Ahlul Sunnah will put the infallibility cloak on the Sahaba. Even though they don't say that the Sahaba were infallible, but technically they have done, practically speaking, that's what they've done. They've put this infallibility cloak on the Sahaba, that even all of the mistakes and the blunders and the evil that some of the companions committed, well, they're unable to look at it like that. They're gonna find some explanation. Oh, it was just ijtihad, and it was just a honest mistake, or it was this. And as if, there was no oppression against the Bani Hashim, or there was no oppression against the Ahlul Bayt, and they completely, wipe off that history, right? And that's something that happens on the other hand, right? Where you put this cloak of good on everyone, all the Sahaba, which is their view, Adalatul Sahaba, where they say that all the Sahaba were adil, they were just people, and so on and so forth. But that's not a very accurate depiction of the early Muslim community either. There were definitely companions and individuals who were just humans at the end of the day, fallible people who make mistakes, who had evil intentions, who were committing oppressions, right? Look at the Umayyads that came, right? So this is something that ends up happening, unfortunately, right? So this is something that I wanted to mention, and this, as I said, these are flaws, and these are fallacies that we commit. And this, now I feel that the day and age that we're living in, it's just such a good opportunity for the younger Muslim community, the younger generation. They have such a good opportunity to learn about Islamic history, through the correct lens, right? A lens which is fair, a lens which doesn't put this cloak or that cloak over all the people, right? It looks at people for what they are. People are never black and white. You can never take an individual and say, well, this person is this and this person is Y. This person is X, this person is Y, and then their entire life is just X or Y. Look at look at someone like Zurara, right? Zurara, the very famous companion of the Imams, from Imam Baqir alayhi salam to Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. If you look at the early life of someone like Zurara, who's considered to be one of the most, reliable and trustworthy companions of the Shia, if you look at his earlier life when he was young, right, you can tell he's a young guy and he's very hyped up and he's very energetic. He argues with the Imams, right? He argues with Imam Baqir alayhi salam. Now imagine you have this, but how does an average Shia explain that? You explain it by saying, well, this person, yes, he believed in Imamat, but he was a young guy. And, people, when they're young, they get hyped up. They get, they have this energy. They want to make sure, they want to prove their point. And you're able to just explain it away because you realize humans are like that. Humans have different personalities. But later on, once Zurara grows up a little bit more, he matures up, he spends more time with the Imams. And by Imam Sadiq alayhi salam's time, he's a lot more mature at that time. And then you don't see that type of a behavior where he's just, arguing with the Imams. In his earlier time, he argues so much that one of the reports says that he starts arguing with Imam Baqir and you could hear the screams outside of the house, right? This is the most trustworthy companion that the Shia have. And here he is, he's arguing with the Imams. He doesn't agree with the Imams when he's young, right? He has a different understanding, and his personality is like that. But if you say that, if you put this infallibility cloak on him, well, how are you going to explain that? You're going to run into trouble. And you cannot also put the cloak of evil on him, because at the end of the day, he's your most trustworthy narrator, right? So why are we able to do such a much more realistic analysis on someone like Zurara as a human who can make certain mistakes, who was fine, sometimes, when he was younger he was like this, when he was older he was like that, and you can explain his narrations away, but you can't do that for other people, right? Sometimes you get obsessed with a scholar, right, and you put this infallibility cloak on them as well, and that turns into a sort of personality worship, where you start thinking that none of the scholar that you admire can never make a mistake, can never make a blunder. This is something that is also very, very common. So anyways, my point was that I was saying that we're living in a time where there is a very good opportunity to educate the next generation of Muslims in a much more nuanced way. Give them a much more realistic description and image of early Islamic history. Okay, that has to do with the second part of my talk, which was the halo and the horn effect. As for the first part, right, about the putting the cloak on yourself, inshallah, make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that, even him giving us the, favoring us with the ability to even have self-reflection, that itself is a favor that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does on us. Asking that favor from him, that at least keep us God conscious, keep us in a state of self-reflection, because we become heedless so quickly, right? We become heedless of what we're doing. Ask for prayers, ask for dua from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to keep you in this state of self-reflection, because the more you can do that, the more you're going to be able to detect these, false justifications that you're making for your immoral acts and devices that you possess currently. Instead, you're going to recognize them for what they are, and you're going to try and basically change them, inshallah. So this is what I wanted to talk about today in today's dictation. It was just a little bit of an expansion of my first of the talk on ujub, which is about conceit, and and at that time also we said the conclusion, one of the main solutions of ujub is to realize that nothing is from you, everything is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You don't own anything. So this false sense of feeling special because you didn't do anything for yourself. It's not that if you gave yourself money, you would have given yourself more. If you gave yourself the looks, you would have good looks, you would have given yourself even better looks. You would have tried to compete with Prophet Yusuf a.s. or something. So these things are from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So from that, we wanted to talk a little bit more about how this ujub can translate into you seeing your evils as good, and how shaitan keeps on, deceiving us in this way. Inshallah, I hope today's talk was a little bit interesting. We touched upon a couple of different aspects. I'll see you all in a future video of the dictations, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Once again, if you have any comments as well, feedback, please feel free to drop them, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.